The church bells were still echoing when Marcus turned to face 300 guests and declared he couldn't marry her. Sarah stood frozen in her white dress, bouquet trembling in her hands, as whispers rippled through the cathedral like wildfire. But the reason he gave for abandoning her at the altar wasn't what anyone expected. And what happened next would expose a web of lies, greed, and betrayal that would change everything she thought she knew about love, family, and her own identity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that love conquered all. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, she'd watched her mother work double shifts at the local diner, while her father remained a distant memory who'd left when she was barely old enough to remember his face. Her mother, Linda, had raised her with stories of fairy tale endings and the belief that someday, the right person would come along and make all the struggles worthwhile. At 26, Sarah worked as a high school English teacher, living in the same modest apartment she'd rented fresh out of college. Her salary barely covered her student loans and her mother's medical bills, but she found joy in the simple things. Weekend farmers markets, book clubs at the local library, and the small garden she tended behind her building. She'd never needed much to be happy, which is perhaps why Marcus's world had seemed so overwhelmingly magical when he first walked into her life. It had been a rainy Tuesday evening when Marcus Blackwood appeared at her classroom door. Sarah was staying late, grading papers by the fluorescent lights, when she heard a knock. She looked up to see a man in an expensive suit, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain, holding a briefcase and wearing an apologetic smile. "Excuse me," he'd said, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm looking for Sarah Mitchell. I'm Marcus Blackwood from Blackwood Development. We're considering a partnership with the school district, and your principal mentioned you might be interested in consulting on our literacy program." Sarah had been immediately struck by how out of place he seemed in her humble classroom, with its faded motivational posters and secondhand furniture. Everything about him screamed wealth and sophistication, from his perfectly tailored jacket to the expensive watch that caught the light when he gestured. Yet there was something warm in his eyes, something that made her feel like she was the only person in the world when he spoke to her. Their first meeting stretched from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Marcus listened intently as Sarah explained her teaching philosophy, her dreams of expanding the school's reading program, and her frustration with the lack of resources. He asked thoughtful questions, took notes in a leather-bound notebook, and by the end of the evening, Sarah felt like she'd found someone who truly understood her passion for education. What started as a professional consultation quickly blossomed into something more. Marcus began showing up at school regularly, claiming he needed to observe classes for the development project. He'd bring Sarah coffee from the expensive cafe downtown, the kind she'd never splurged on herself. He'd stay after her classes ended, walking her to her car and finding excuses to extend their conversations. Within a month, their professional relationship had transformed into romantic dinners at restaurants Sarah had only read about in magazines. Marcus would arrive to pick her up in cars that cost more than she made in 2 years, but he never made her feel small or out of place. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her world, asking about her students, listening to her stories about growing up with her mother, and encouraging her dreams of writing the novel she'd been putting off for years. Their courtship felt like a whirlwind romance from one of the books she taught her students. Marcus showered her with attention and affection, but more importantly, he made her feel valued and heard. When her mother's health took a turn for the worse, requiring expensive treatments, Marcus quietly handled the medical bills without making a big show of it. When Sarah's car broke down, he simply handed her keys to a reliable sedan and told her not to worry about it. The proposal came 6 months later, during a weekend getaway to a mountain resort that Sarah never could have afforded on her own. Marcus had arranged everything perfectly, from the sunset timing to the photographer hidden among the trees. When he dropped to one knee beside the lake, presenting a ring that sparkled like captured starlight, Sarah felt like she was living in a dream. The engagement period was a blur of planning and preparation that felt surreal to someone who'd grown up counting every penny. Marcus insisted they spare no expense for the wedding, claiming he wanted their special day to be perfect. He hired the best wedding planner in the state, booked the historic St. Augustine Cathedral, and arranged for a reception at the exclusive Grandview Manor. Sarah sometimes felt overwhelmed by the scale of everything. The dress-fitting appointments in boutiques where a single gown cost more than her yearly salary, The cake tastings featuring flavors she'd never heard of. The florist consultations where arrangements were discussed like works of art. But Marcus assured her that she deserved all of it, that he wanted to give her the fairy tale wedding she'd dreamed of as a little girl. The guest list grew to include people Sarah had never met, Marcus's business associates, family friends, and what seemed like half the social elite of the surrounding cities. Sarah's side of the cathedral would be sparsely populated, she realized with some embarrassment. Her mother, a few teacher friends, her college roommate, and the elderly couple who ran the bookstore where she spent her weekends. The contrast made her feel small, but Marcus dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. These events are always about business connections, he'd explained. Don't worry about numbers. The people who matter will be there, and that's all that counts. The week before the wedding, Sarah moved temporarily into Marcus's penthouse apartment to make the final preparations easier. The space was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. But it felt cold and impersonal, lacking the warmth of her small apartment with its mismatched furniture and shelves full of beloved books. She'd tried to bring some of her personality into the space, placing a few of her favorite novels on the coffee table and hanging a small painting her art students had made for her. But Marcus had gently suggested they pack those things away for now, explaining that his cleaning service worked better with minimal clutter. The night before the wedding, Sarah lay in Marcus's enormous bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to calm her nerves. Everything had moved so quickly, and sometimes she felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. Tomorrow, she would wake up as Sarah Mitchell, small-town teacher, and go to sleep as Mrs. Marcus Blackwood, wife of one of the region's most successful developers. Her mother had expressed some concerns during their last private conversation. Linda Mitchell was a practical woman who'd learned to be cautious about things that seemed too good to be true. She'd pulled Sarah aside during the rehearsal dinner and asked if she was certain about everything. "Honey," her mother had said quietly, "I want you to be happy more than anything in the world. But marriage is about more than fancy dinners and expensive gifts. Do you really know who Marcus is? Do you know what he wants from life? What makes him laugh? What he's afraid of?" Sarah had reassured her mother that she and Marcus had talked about everything that mattered. They wanted the same thing, she insisted. A family, a home filled with love, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But even as she said the words, Sarah realized she knew more about Marcus's business successes than his childhood fears, more about his investment portfolio than his favorite memories. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made everything look like a movie set. Sarah woke in the bridal suite at Grandview Manor, surrounded by her bridesmaids and the controlled chaos of final preparations. Hairstylists, makeup artists, and photographers moved around her like a well-choreographed dance, transforming her into a version of herself that belonged in the pages of a bridal magazine. Her dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace, custom designed by a couturier whose name Sarah had only heard whispered in reverent tones. It fit her perfectly, making her feel like a princess stepping out of a fairy tale. The veil had belonged to Marcus's grandmother, a family heirloom that connected her to generations of Blackwood brides who had worn it before her. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself looking forward to seeing Marcus at the altar. They'd followed the tradition of not seeing each other the night before the wedding, and she'd missed his reassuring presence. She wanted to share this moment with him, to see his face when she walked down the aisle, to exchange the vows they'd written together during quiet evenings in his apartment. The limousine ride to the cathedral felt like floating on a cloud. Sarah sat carefully in her dress, watching the familiar streets of her hometown roll by through tinted windows. Everything looked different from this perspective, smaller somehow, as if she was already moving beyond the life she'd known into something entirely new. St. Augustine Cathedral was magnificent, its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky like prayers made of stone. Sarah had attended services here as a child with her mother, sitting in the back pews and marveling at the stained-glass windows that painted rainbow patterns on the floor. Now, those same windows would provide the backdrop for her wedding, transforming the sacred space into the setting for her happiest day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bridal party assembled in the church's preparation room, a flurry of final touch-ups and nervous excitement. Sarah's maid of honor, Jessica, her college roommate who'd flown in from Seattle, helped adjust her veil and whispered encouraging words. The other bridesmaids, friends from school, and a few of Marcus's female relatives chatted quietly and checked their makeup one last time. Through the closed doors, Sarah could hear the sounds of the gathering crowd. 300 guests, Marcus had said, though the number still seemed impossibly large to someone who'd grown up in a town where everyone knew everyone else. She could hear the organ music beginning, the traditional wedding march that had signaled countless beginnings throughout the cathedral's long history. Her mother appeared in the doorway, elegant in the navy blue dress they'd chosen together, tears already threatening her carefully applied mascara. Linda Mitchell had worked extra shifts for months to afford the dress, insisting that she wanted to look worthy of standing beside her daughter on such an important day. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," her mother whispered, taking Sarah's hands carefully to avoid disturbing her gloves. "Are you ready for this?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Sarah replied. And in that moment, she meant it completely. The processional began with Jessica leading the way, followed by the other bridesmaids in their coordinated dresses of deep burgundy. Sarah watched through a crack in the door as each of her friends made their way down the aisle, their faces glowing with happiness for her special day. The cathedral was filled to capacity, every pew occupied by guests in their finest attire. Finally, it was Sarah's turn. The organist struck the opening chords of the bridal march, and the congregation rose as one. Sarah took her mother's arm, grateful for the tradition that would allow Linda to walk her down the aisle in place of the father who'd never been part of their lives. The heavy cathedral doors opened, and Sarah stepped into what should have been the most magical moment of her life. The aisle stretched before her like a runway to her future, lined with flowers and candles that cast everything in a warm, golden glow. At the far end, she could see Marcus waiting at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair gleaming under the cathedral lights. But something was wrong. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in Marcus's posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. His best man, David, was whispering something urgent in his ear, and Marcus kept shaking his head in response. Sarah continued walking, her smile beginning to falter as she got closer and could see Marcus's face more clearly. He looked pale, almost ill, and there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear? Guilt? She couldn't tell, but whatever it was made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. The walk down the aisle, which should have taken only a few minutes, felt like it lasted forever. With each step, Sarah became more aware that something was terribly wrong. Whispers were starting to ripple through the congregation, and several guests were checking their phones with confused expressions. When Sarah finally reached the altar, she expected Marcus to take her hand, to smile at her with the love and devotion she'd seen in his eyes so many times before. Instead, he stood frozen, staring at her as if she were a stranger. Reverend Thompson began the ceremony with the traditional opening words, his voice echoing through the cathedral with practiced authority. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus and Sarah in holy matrimony." But Marcus wasn't looking at Sarah anymore. His eyes were fixed on something in the back of the church, and his face had gone completely white. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a man in an expensive suit standing near the doors holding what appeared to be legal documents. The man nodded once at Marcus, a gesture that seemed to carry enormous significance. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Sarah saw that her fairy tale was about to become a nightmare. "I can't do this," Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through the Reverend's words like a knife through silk. The cathedral fell completely silent. 300 guests held their breath. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways as she stared at the man she'd thought she would spend her life with. "Marcus, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the absolute quiet. He turned to face her fully for the first time since she'd reached the altar, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart stop. This wasn't last-minute nerves or wedding jitters. This was something much worse. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, loud enough for the entire congregation to hear. "I can't marry you." This whole thing was a mistake. The gasps from the crowd sounded like a wave crashing against rocks. Sarah felt her bouquet slip from her numb fingers, the carefully arranged flowers scattering across the marble floor like fallen dreams. "What do you mean?" she managed to ask. though part of her already suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Marcus glanced again at the man with the documents, who was now walking slowly down the aisle toward them. "I mean, this marriage can't happen. Not today. Not ever." The cathedral erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Some guests were standing, craning their necks to get a better view of the drama unfolding at the altar. Others were reaching for their phones, already documenting what would surely become the scandal of the season. But Sarah heard none of it. All she could focus on was Marcus's face, searching desperately for some sign that this was a terrible joke, a misunderstanding that could be quickly resolved. Instead, she saw only a stranger wearing her fiancé's face, someone who could destroy her in front of everyone she'd ever cared about, and walk away without a backward glance. The man with the documents had reached the altar now, and he handed Marcus a thick envelope with a satisfied smile. Marcus took it with shaking hands, and Sarah realized that whatever was in that envelope was the reason her perfect wedding was crumbling around her. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice stronger now, anger beginning to cut through the shock and humiliation. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been pity, which somehow made everything worse. "That's James Hartford," he said. "He's a private investigator." Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. A private investigator? What could that possibly have to do with their wedding? The answer, when it came, shattered everything she thought she knew about her life, her identity, and the man she'd almost married. But that revelation would have to wait, because Marcus was already removing his boutonniere, already stepping back from the altar where their vows should have been exchanged. "I'm sorry," he said again, but his words were drowned out by the chaos that was beginning to erupt throughout the cathedral. "I truly am sorry, Sarah. But I can't marry someone who's been lying to me about who she really is." And with that impossible statement hanging in the air like a sword about to fall, Marcus Blackwood walked away from their altar, their future, and the woman who had believed with all her heart that love really could conquer all. The cathedral fell into stunned silence as Marcus's words echoed off the stone walls. Sarah stood frozen in her wedding dress, the bouquet scattered at her feet, trying to process what he'd just said, lying about who she really was. What could that possibly mean? James Hartford, the private investigator, stepped forward with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral. "Or should I say, Miss Thornfield?" Sarah's world tilted. Thornfield? She'd never heard that name before in her life. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I've never been anyone else." Hartford opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "According to my investigation, commissioned by Mr. Blackwood here, you are actually Sarah Thornfield, daughter of the late billionaire industrialist Robert Thornfield." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Robert Thornfield was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a reclusive business mogul whose empire spanned everything from real estate to technology. She'd read about his death in the newspapers just 6 months ago, but she'd never imagined any connection to her own life. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "My father left when I was 2 years old. My mother raised me alone. We've never had any money, never had any connections to wealthy families." Marcus stepped forward, his face a mask of cold determination. "That's what I thought too, Sarah. Until I started noticing things that didn't add up. The way you sometimes mentioned memories that seemed too sophisticated for your background. The way you instinctively knew which fork to use at expensive restaurants, even though you claimed you'd never been to places like that before." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You hired an investigator because I knew proper table manners." "It was more than that," Marcus continued, his voice growing harder. "You never talked about your father, but sometimes you'd slip and mention things he'd supposedly told you. Stories that seemed too detailed for someone who claimed he'd abandoned you as a toddler." Hartford cleared his throat and began reading from his documents. "Robert Thornfield had a daughter named Sarah with Linda Mitchell, a waitress he met during a business trip to Millbrook 26 years ago. When their relationship ended, he set up a trust fund for the child, but agreed to Linda's request to stay out of their lives completely." Sarah felt like she was drowning. None of this made sense. Her mother had always told her that her father was a traveling salesman who'd moved on when things got serious. There had never been any mention of money, of trust funds, of a billionaire father. The investigator continued reading. "Linda Mitchell has been receiving monthly payments of $5,000 for 24 years, deposited into a separate account under the name LM Enterprises. The payments were described as child support, but Miss Mitchell never told her daughter about the arrangement. $5,000 a month? Sarah's mind reeled. That was more than her mother made at the diner. All those years of watching her mother work double shifts, worry about medical bills, scrimp and save for every small luxury. All those years, and there had been money they never knew about. But there's more, Hartford said, his smile growing wider. Robert Thornfield died 6 months ago, and his will has been in probate. According to the terms of his estate, his daughter Sarah inherits everything. The entire Thornfield fortune estimated at $2 billion. The cathedral erupted in shocked gasps and whispers. Sarah felt her knees give out, and she grabbed the altar rail to keep from falling. $1 billion? It was impossible. It was insane. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of, and it was destroying her life. Marcus was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold calculation mixed with something that looked almost like hunger. "Now you understand why I can't go through with this wedding," he said. "I thought I was marrying a sweet, humble teacher who would be grateful for the life I could give her. Instead, I discover I'm dealing with someone who's been hiding the fact that she's about to become one of the richest women in America." Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I didn't know. Marcus, I swear to you, I had no idea about any of this." "That's what makes it worse," he said, turning to address the stunned congregation. "I've spent months planning this wedding, investing in our future together, believing I was rescuing someone from poverty. Now I find out that in a few weeks, she'll be worth 1,000 times more than I am." The guests were murmuring among themselves, some standing up to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Sarah caught sight of her mother in the front row, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. Marcus continued his public humiliation with surgical precision. "I can't be married to someone who will always wonder if I'm only with them for their money. I can't build a life with someone whose fortune makes my success look like pocket change. You're leaving me because I might inherit money I didn't know existed?" Sarah's voice was growing stronger, anger beginning to cut through the shock and pain. "You're destroying our wedding, humiliating me in front of everyone we know, because you can't handle the possibility that I might not need you financially?" "It's about trust, Sarah," Marcus shot back. "It's about honesty. How can I believe anything you've told me when you've been living a lie your entire life?" "I haven't been living a lie." Sarah's voice echoed through the cathedral now, her fury finally overriding her shock. "I've been living the only life I've ever known. I've been exactly who I told you I was. A teacher from a small town whose mother worked in a diner. The fact that my father was someone I never knew doesn't change who I am." But Marcus was already walking away, Hartford beside him like a satisfied shadow. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way," he called back without turning around, "but I can't marry someone I don't trust. Someone whose inheritance makes our entire relationship a lie." The cathedral doors slammed shut behind them, leaving Sarah standing alone at the altar in her $1,000 dress, surrounded by 300 witnesses to her public destruction. The whispers grew louder, some guests pulling out phones to capture her humiliation, others looking uncomfortable but making no move to leave. Sarah's mother finally broke free from her shock and rushed to the altar, her arms wrapping around her daughter despite the elaborate dress and veil. "Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Tell me none of this is true. Tell me you don't know anything about this money, about this Robert Thornfield." Linda Mitchell's face crumpled, and Sarah knew the truth before her mother spoke a word. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Linda whispered. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you never knew about him, about the money, you could have a normal life." "You knew." Sarah pulled back to stare at her mother in disbelief. "You knew about the trust fund. You knew I had a billionaire father, and you never told me." Linda's tears were flowing freely now. "He wanted to be part of your life, honey. But I was so young, so scared. I thought his world would corrupt you, change you into someone I didn't recognize. I made him promise to stay away, and he did. But he made sure we were taken care of, even if you never knew it." Sarah felt like she was seeing her entire life through new eyes. Every time her mother had mysteriously managed to pay for something that should have been beyond their means. Sarah's college tuition, which had somehow been covered by a scholarship she'd never applied for. Her mother's medical bills, which had been paid by insurance that Linda claimed came through the diner. The wedding guests were beginning to leave now, some casting sympathetic glances in Sarah's direction, others clearly thrilled to have witnessed such spectacular drama. Sarah heard fragments of their conversations as they filed out. Can you believe it? Billions of dollars. No wonder he ran. What a scandal. Jessica, her maid of honor, approached cautiously. Sarah, honey, we should get you out of here. Let's go back to the bridal suite and figure this out. But Sarah wasn't ready to hide. She was exhausted by the revelations, devastated by Marcus's betrayal, but she was also beginning to feel something else, a growing sense of liberation. For the first time in her life, she understood why she'd always felt like she was meant for something more than her small-town existence. As the cathedral emptied, Sarah remained at the altar with her mother and closest friends. The flowers and candles that had been meant to celebrate her wedding now seemed to mark the end of one life and the beginning of something entirely different. 3 weeks later, the lawyers confirmed what Hartford had announced so dramatically. Sarah was indeed the sole heir to the Thornfield fortune, making her one of the wealthiest women in the world virtually overnight. The transition was surreal, involving meetings with financial advisors, estate managers, and a board of directors, who suddenly treated her with the kind of deference she'd never experienced. Sarah moved into her father's mansion, a sprawling estate that felt like a museum dedicated to the life she'd never known she should have lived. She found photo albums filled with pictures of herself as a child, pictures her father had somehow obtained and treasured, letters he'd written but never sent, detailing his hopes for her future, and his regret at honoring Linda's request to stay away. The hardest part was learning about the man she'd never had the chance to know. Robert Thornfield had been brilliant and driven, but also lonely and haunted by the daughter he'd given up. His business empire had been built partly as a legacy for Sarah, a gift he'd hoped to share with her someday. Marcus had tried to contact her several times after the inheritance was confirmed. He'd sent flowers, written letters, even shown up at the estate gates claiming he'd made a terrible mistake. But Sarah had learned something important in the ruins of her wedding day. Someone who would abandon you in your moment of greatest vulnerability wasn't someone worth building a life with. Instead, she threw herself into learning about her father's business empire and her new responsibilities. She discovered a passion for the corporate world that surprised everyone, including herself. Within 6 months, she was actively involved in running Thornfield Industries, bringing fresh perspectives to ventures that had grown stagnant under conservative management. Sarah also established the Linda Mitchell Foundation, honoring her mother's strength and dedication by providing support for single mothers trying to build better lives for their children. It felt like the perfect way to use her unexpected fortune, helping other families avoid the struggles she and her mother had endured. One evening, almost a year after the wedding that never was, Sarah sat in her father's study reading through his personal papers. She found a letter he'd written to her on her 18th birthday but never sent, expressing his hope that someday she would understand why he'd stayed away and his dream that they might eventually build a relationship. She also found a file containing every newspaper clipping about her academic achievements, every school play program, every small-town success story. He'd been watching from a distance all along, proud of the woman she was becoming even though he couldn't be part of her journey. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her assistant, informing her that Marcus Blackwood's development company had filed for bankruptcy. Apparently, his business had been built on leveraged investments and borrowed time. Without the marriage to Sarah and the social connections it would have provided, his empire had crumbled. Sarah felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a profound gratitude that she'd discovered his true character before binding her life to his. She'd learned that real love doesn't run away when circumstances change, and that someone who truly values you doesn't humiliate you the moment things become complicated. As she looked around her father's study, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had endured despite distance and separation, Sarah realized that her real inheritance wasn't the billions of dollars or the business empire. It was the knowledge that she was worthy of being loved completely, honestly, and without conditions. The fairy tale ending she'd dreamed of as a little girl hadn't happened the way she'd expected, but the truth had turned out to be far better than any fantasy. She was exactly who she'd always been, Sarah Mitchell from Millbrook, who happened to also be Sarah Thornfield, heiress to a fortune and a legacy of love that had never truly abandoned her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.